today, Reverend Randy Lewis here, my good friend, my brother, we decided to have a dialogue. We wanted to know what your questions are at the beginning of a new kind of school year or year together. We wanted to see what your questions are. So people have been emailing questions to us, and I'm putting it in the comments online. We've tried to solicit as many as we can, and we answered a number in the last service at 10, but we didn't get to the last two, so we're going to start with the last two so that we make sure we answer those, and any more that we don't get to, we'll post about it or write about it or try to do a message maybe. So we want to know what what's relevant to your lives. So we may do more of these kind of dialogue messages as the year goes on. If people seem to like them, we have a number of different folks who could be a part of this with us. So anyway, we start with your questions, and Lee Rumley is going to read them for us.
A number of people have questions about transgender issues, such as use of pronouns, medical care for children and youth, and regarding sports. Could you all speak to that?
So that's a great question, and it's, we see it happening all the time, even the Olympics, people are interjecting the issues into the Olympics and other things. So and obviously we can't give a long dissertation. That would be a whole message in and of itself. But so I want to just give a sense of how I orient myself to these questions to the degree that it'll be helpful to you. I think of two things. One was around pronouns. I remember my father, who's 88 years old, 5-6 years ago when more people were using pronouns, stating their pronouns and things like that. And my father is a cisgendered, straight male. From a different generation, and he had the opportunity, because he's a hospice volunteer. He was volunteering with someone who was transgender, identified as transgender, and that person explained, he really was impacted by that relationship, and he said this to me, and I thought it was really worth passing on. He said, I learned that it's a little uncomfortable sometimes for me to say my gender pronouns or to ask somebody theirs, because I don't know how they're going to react, and it just seems different from how I've been throughout my life. He said, but what I realized was that my friend here, and anyone whose gender might be different from the what we consider have been considered norm for so long, they go through a lot of discomfort all the time. And so if I could just for me, it's like 15, 20 seconds of discomfort. And he said, I'm certainly willing to be uncomfortable for 15, 20 seconds, 30 seconds in a relationship to talk about gender pronouns if it's going to help make that person's life even a little bit more comfortable and that person feel more included. And so I just thought the graciousness of that was really important, and it helped me, and I wanted to share that because I think it's true for those of us who are what we call cisgendered, right, who continue to live with the gender that we were assigned at birth, and that we tend to feel more comfortable in the world. And there's high rates of addiction, high rates of suicide and things like that in the transgender community, or genderqueer community, non-binary, because of how society treats folks. And so I think anything that we can do to make folks' lives feel more included is worthwhile. So gender pronouns, that's an easy one. I don't know the answer to sports. I need to do more research to understand all of what it's about. But what I do know is sports was incredibly important to me growing up. I was very involved in sports. Some of my relationships with coaches, teams, individual challenges that it put me through. And I know I want that for every child who's interested in doing sports. So whatever we have to figure out to make it work, I want to make sure that sports is something that every child, every young person, every adult is able to participate in if that's what they want to. And I hope we can stay in an open conversation and figure out what's going to make the most sense going forward. That's my best thought, on those two things. And then the other thing I'll just say about gender reassignment surgeries and hormones and things, especially with young people who are not of age, themselves. I know that's really controversial, and what I think about that is that I don't have a child who's transgender or non-binary, and I'm not a doctor. So I really don't know what's best. And so I don't feel like I'm the one who should be deciding for these families what to do. I think that it's up to the parents, the child, and their doctors to figure out what's best. I don't know, you want to add to that?
Yeah. Wow, so that, he just summed it up. I could have answered it any better, but I had some thoughts. As a member of the LGBTQ plus community, I still don't have an informed decision to be able to speak to that, to trans issues wholeheartedly. I do have a story I would like to tell. Maybe that would help me formulate some thoughts or kind of share where my heart may be. So when Dimitri and I were in Raleigh, we started a LGBTQ plus meetup group. And when we first started, people started attending, and there was this one awkward-looking guy. He had a bunch of tattoos, he had blue hair, but he was really shy and withdrawn. And we'd have another social event, and he'd come back again, and we'd have another one, he'd come again, and he was still shy and awkward, but as he started attending more of those meetings, he started opening up. And then we noticed him starting to wear a little bit more feminine dress. And then it was about a month or two later that he came fully in makeup, dress, and he was talking about transitioning, or now she was talking about transitioning. And she became a central part of our group. And we'd go out to places, and we know that people would be looking at her, and we were like standing guard. Like, if you say anything with her, you're gonna have to speak to all of us. We were ready to fight because we loved loved her so much. But she said something, and I read it. She said something just here a few days on Facebook that just really spoke volumes to me and Dee, and we had a conversation around it. Someone was disappointed with the group. Since we left, things have changed. But someone was disappointed with the group, and they left the group, and they were saying, this group, da, 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 da. She said, she honored them. She said, I'm sorry that you feel this way, but let me tell you, this group saved my life. And it still just is heartbreaking. I mean, it just touches my heartstrings. And she said, this group changed my life. And she wrote a lot of stuff about how there was no community that had surrounded her. And we did. And the reason why I brought this up is because I'm thinking we are that community here too. Because I had been a part of the LGBT community for years, but it was only here that I came out, right? A few years ago across this pulpit, because it was the community that supported me and surrounded me and made me feel safe. So all the dialogue about pronouns and sports seems like a ruse to what's really going on in people's lives. And I want to encourage us to create a space just for people to be and to be free and to surround them in love and let them be the best that they can be. And so I think this is what this community allows or creates, and that's what we created for that individual in Raleigh. So that's all I have to say about the matter.
What are your favorite approaches to combat racist, homophobic, transphobic talking points?
Well, you may weigh in on that one.
Jump in.
Well, and I've been preaching this, if you guys, or sharing it in my messages for the last few messages, is about dialogue and knowing that when that stuff happens, when we hear it, we see it, it's usually someone talking through their pain, through their anger, and if we can, if we're able to see their humanity through the midst of that, and try to find some common ground, some commonality to share our hearts, maybe we can get down to the main part of what's really going on. I wouldn't tell you to avoid that. I mean, for self-care, you might want to get yourself out of the situation or excuse yourself. But I would encourage all of us to find a way to stay in dialogue with people. That's what I've been sharing. It's what Marlon, we've been talking about. How do we stay at the table? And how do we change the homophobe? That's the bigger. How do we change the transphobe? How do we change them? Well, I guarantee you it'll have to start with some dialogue.
Yeah, I think that for me, it goes back to this idea that I think that the most change that I've had is true. It's through dialogue, it's through meeting people who are different from me. And then it's like, I care about that person. So it's not an abstract issue, it's the person. But I think as terms of strategies, for me, I think the biggest impact on me, besides being in a relationship with someone different from me, which is always impactful, it's actually seeing modeled people who are like me, who are open on these issues and who speak openly on the issues. Then I say, oh, I see how I can do that. And I want to be like that person. So as I would identify, or this culture would identify me, and I would identify myself as white, straight, cisgendered male. So when I see a person who's like me, looks like me, or who I identify with in that way, speaking really openly about LGBT, is affirming about LGBT, or about race issues, or about transgender, any of those things, I find, or women, standing up for men, standing up for women, then I go, yeah, that's who I want to be in the world. That's how I want to show up in these conversations. And that's had a big impact on me. So now I try to be that kind of person when I have the opportunity to speak, both in public, but also in private conversations as well.
Yeah. And I think
that's my strategy.
Just to touch upon that, when you're in conversation, to have the person that's using that homophobic language to explore how, in essence, ask them, how do you think a person hearing what you're saying might feel or interpret what you're saying? So ask them to unpack what they're saying and to connect the impact of what they're saying to someone's life. So,
I got one more.
yes.
You just made me think of that. So, but it's also for me is being open and accepting and non-judgmental to people who, when I am speaking to them, because I think there's too many people who I see, particularly in progressive circles, who it's like, they just assume everybody has to, have the right, check all the boxes on, I'm, super feminist and I'm LGBT friendly and I'm all those things. But how does somebody get there? And so for me, I recognize that there's a lot of people, because it took me a while to learn and have experiences to get there where I could feel as open as I am today. And so what I realize is there are a lot of people who maybe have legitimate questions that they're wrestling with about equality in different ways. And I think it's really important for me to be able to listen and accept the person and have the conversation, because nobody wants to just be told, oh, this is the way it's supposed to be, and you can't be a member of All Souls unless you're completely, woke on all these issues. I think that'd be great if we could all agree completely and we could all be in the same place, but it's a journey. And so I always want to make this a place, and I've said to people from the pulpit here that if you're struggling with trying to figure out this transgender in sports, or these pronouns, or this, whatever the issue is, it feels like race has, been flipped on its head, it's reverse racism. If you're having those questions, I don't want to delegitimize your question or your struggle. And I want to be a safe place and a safe person for you to be able to voice it, and then begin to, as Randy was saying, say, oh yeah, okay, and then begin to think deeper about it. So that's what I'd like us all to do as a community, is be a safe place where, because otherwise people have to show up here, they have to go learn all this stuff and open their hearts completely before they even show up. Well, where's that supposed to happen? And then they walk in our door. So I want us to be a place where people's hearts can open and they can become more inclusive. But that requires us to be willing to accept people where they are and hopefully stay in dialogue so that they can grow with us.
What religion were you raised, and how did it impact your sense of identity, both positively and negatively?
You want me to do that?
Sure. I've been talking.
Well, I was raised Baptist in my early years. Then I went to Pentecostalism, and then ended up, of course, here, you. So I call myself the first ever Unibapticostal. I laugh about that. But so my Baptist and Pentecostal faith traditions were really profound for me. I had these really, really deep spiritual experiences in both of them. Now, a lot of it was connected to some trauma, deep trauma in my childhood, and the loss of a couple of my brothers who had tragic deaths, and just a lot of difficulties in my life. And religion was that sense of balance, that sense of was foundational. It was a place of safety that I would go. And so I still cherish those experiences. Now, of course, I grew intellectually, and then things started not connecting as far as my reality versus what I thought. And then I had what one might call a crisis of faith, and I left the ministry. Now, a lot of that was connected to my sexuality, and in the church, even though there was a lot of gay people in the church, they were the choirs members, they were the choir conductors, and some of them were the ministers. But they were all don't ask, don't tell. We know that's you, but don't say a word, don't come out. And so it was really suppressed. And part of that was my story, is that religion, while it healed me on one big aspect, it also suppressed me in the other. And I told in the last service about being broken and had gone through this big crisis of faith and didn't know where I was going to land. And we had joined Higher Dimensions, Dimitri and I, and we were going there. We were sitting in the congregation for a couple of years, and no one ever asked us if we was part of it. They saw this white guy and this black guy with their kids. We had our families, and I know that we had to be the talk of the town, but no one ever said anything. But when we came here as a church, it was Marlin actually walked up to Dee and I and said, "Hey, are you two together?" And we didn't know how to answer that question. I looked at Dee and I said, "Yes, we are." And then he said something that was so profound, and that I tell him this, that I was away from the ministry. I left the ministry. He said, "I heard you were a Baptist preacher." I said, "Yes." Would you consider joining our staff? And it was at that moment that he restored my call, or gave me my call to ministry. That's the reason why I'm here today. So, yeah. So I give that to him. Otherwise, I don't know where I would be. But yes, so
That's great.
that's how it's impacted me.
Well, that's really wonderful to hear that.
Don't take it to your head. Don't let it go to your head now.
No, I mean, I remember the part where I'm saying, when I said, "Are you two a couple?" And then there was this long silence, and I thought, "Oh, did I say the wrong thing?" Walk up to two guys and ask them if they're a couple, and it's depending on who it is. You never know how they're going to respond to that. But I try not to assume heterosexuality when I meet people. I grew up, my father was raised Jewish, my mother was raised Catholic, and they met in the 1950s, and they got married, and neither one wanted to convert, and so they went out looking for a religious home where they could go together, and both Christianity would be accepted and Judaism would be accepted, and they wouldn't have to convert, and that their children could be raised getting positive messages about both traditions, and also learn about the world's religions and Native American spirituality, and it was open to science and evolution, and so they found the Unitarian Universalist Church back in the early 60s, and they raised me and my brother as in the Unitarian Universalist Church. So I was born and raised in this tradition, and I think it had a really positive effect on me in a lot of ways. We teach sexuality education to our teens, and that was really important to be able to learn, in an open environment, any question that we had. It's a great program. We still do that to this day. And also the just the openness around spirituality. And I think it became really important in the second half of my life. I was born in 1968. As our country started to open up in a different way. I mean, I was still raised in the 70s, educated in the 70s and 80s. We were still learning the white men's history of the world. You know, all the great things that white men, you know, whether it's Freud or Marx or Shakespeare or, you know, just the whole list. And that we were still taught in grade school that the Pilgrims and the Native peoples got together and had a big party and we created this lovely, you know, love fest together. And so it was only in the 90s that and then the early 2000s that we started to question these things. And I think it was really helpful for me to be in a community where I was able to grow and learn that accepted openly LGBT folks and affirmed women as equal and really strove for racial justice and equality. That it really helped me be in this landing place as all that change has been happening. And it's continued, you know, through Black Lives Matter and to this day, marriage equality. And so it's continued, and I'm just glad to have this kind of an environment. I would say that on the negative, because that was part of the question, I think that the piece that I had to work through was that, at least in the generation that I was raised, I think it's still true today, it's still that the biggest flaw of Unitarian Universalists can be that we can become arrogant and think that we're a superior, like that all these other religious people don't know what they're doing, we've got it figured out, like we know what's right. And I think that that's probably the biggest error that we can fall into in our tradition, or the biggest hypocrisy that we could fall into. And so, you know, as I've learned, as I've grown and had more exposure to different people and different religions, I've realized there's a lot of very intelligent people, very loving people who are following lots of different religious paths. And so I've learned that there's many ways to be religious. And just because there's certain fundamentalists who are really rigid and narrow and can be very controlling, that's just one slice of the religious pie. And so that's, I think, the biggest thing I've learned is to be open to people having different religious approaches and really, truly accepting them. Not just saying I accept them, but really finding that acceptance.
Beautiful.
In most religions, women have been relegated to a lower status, instructed by their leaders to listen to the guidance from males. As males, please talk to All Souls members about equality of females in UU ministry. How do you view the spirituality of the divine feminine?
So I'll touch upon as far as women in UU ministry. Of course, my observation, I'm sure Marlin can speak more to that, is that there's a lot of women in authority in this movement. And they do own their space, a lot of them. So they will not let a guy run them over in many instances. This is what I have noticed. But from my own tradition, women have been the backbone of our families. It was my grandmother, my aunt, my mom. And in many instances, it's not all cases, but men were absent in in my family they were, and in a lot of my close relatives and community, the men were wherever they were. And some of them in prison, some of them just were absent. But it was the women that were always the ones that was the voice of God in the instance, you know, that divine. They had that final authority. And so, I mean, even in church, you know, the preachers would say, oh, the man is supposed to run the household. I've heard that so many times. And the women would say, yes, that's true. But I know who ran the household. We all know who ran the household. It was the women. And they would have the final say. So, like I said in the last service, women, they were God. They are God to me. Right. Women, you're God.
Wow.
You're that
All
divine.
Right. All right. So there's a two-part question. So the first one about Unitarian Universalist ministry, women in Unitarian Universalist ministry. We struggled with all the same patriarchal values that our culture has struggled with. I think we've always been a little bit ahead of the curve as a religious group, but it took time to have women ministers and then to, fully accepted. I will say that the first woman ordained by a denomination in the United States of America was Olympia Brown, who was ordained by the Universalist Church of America back in the 19th century. So I'm really, we can claim that, which is one good thing. And today, over 50% of our Unitarian Universalist ministers are female, are women. So that's pretty amazing where we've come over the time, and they're incredible leaders, including the president of our national association as well, Sophia Bentoncourt, is an incredible leader and a woman. Then it asks about the divine feminine, and I love that question, because when you think about it, before Christianity, came and dominated so much of the religious world, particularly through the West and through parts of Asia and Africa, women, the goddess was worshipped. Greek culture and African cultures and there was the women. You see goddess statues that they uncover in these archaeological digs and things like that. And it makes sense, right? That women, what's going to be the symbol of creating new life, creation and new life and nurturing new life is women. It makes it just biological. If you're looking for a metaphor, women are the ones through whom life comes. And so, but with Christianity and then later with Islam, there was this suppression of the female idea of the divine. And so the patriarchy became really strong and reinforced across our culture. For me, I learned about the divine feminine a lot when I lived for 2 years in Kyoto, Japan, and then for 2 years I was traveling through Asia and studying religion, and in the Hindu tradition, they have a lot of goddesses as part of their tradition, and so I learned a lot about the divine feminine from the Hindu and the Eastern traditions. Kuan Yin in Buddhism is another example in Buddhism. But I will say that in Christianity, in our Western tradition, I do like what the Catholic Church does with Mother Mary, because Mother Mary becomes, very significant, can be in that tradition. And I think that's, when I finally realized that you could read the Bible without reading it literally, that these are stories that could teach us something, I remember thinking, well, it's pretty darn significant that if God decided to come into the world, right, according to the story. Now, again, I'm taking this as metaphor, but so the story's saying that when God decides to come into the world, God chooses a woman, chooses not just any woman, a poor woman, a brown woman, a woman in a rural, nowhere, who's not even educated. So God, you could think about it, they could have told the story that God came through a queen, or some great dignified woman that's, held up in esteem in some aristocratic family. But this tradition tells people, no, God came into the world through the most humble of people. And I think it says a great deal about the divine feminine and the role of women. And the other thing I'll just say that's a more modern thing, this isn't about divinity so much, but I've been really taken by the fact that this is not I'm not making a political point here, no matter how you think of these political figures. I'm just saying that across the board, there are many people on both sides of the aisle right now in the United States who I've heard them say Nancy Pelosi is the best Speaker of the House this country has ever had. There's a lot of respect for her as a leader. Even if they disagree, they're like, boy, she got stuff done. She was an incredible leader. She could move power. So my point in this is, again, not a political point. My point is this. She's the first female Speaker of the House that we've had in this country. For how many generations and how many centuries did we keep women out of politics? Couldn't even vote until the 1920s. And then out of politics and out of leadership. And then when we finally have the first, she becomes the best, arguably the best we've ever had. So I think that I'm hoping that her example, among many others that we see in our society today, are helping us realize, oh my gosh, we need to recognize that women are as good a leaders, in some ways better leaders than the men, and that we need to leave open equality. Otherwise, we're missing out on half of the best of what we have as a culture.